Sadly, the internet is full of misinformation, myths about how to tell if your firewood is dry. Things like that the wood will change color, or that the end will be full of cracks, or that the bark will fall off, or that it just feels light, or perhaps even that it dries at 1 inch per year. All of that's wrong, or at least it's so misleading as to be no use at all for making sure that your firewood is properly dry. But what do I mean by properly dry? I mean, you want your firewood to be between 15 and 20% water by weight. That might seem kind of odd. I mean, wouldn't you want it to be 0%? Well, not really. It's unfeasible to do, and even if you could, you wouldn't want to. I'll explain more about that in a few moments. Let's have a look at some of these myths in detail so that your firewood is properly dry. Myth number 1, cracks in the end of the piece of wood tell you that it's properly dry. I see this one on the internet all the time. It's not true. This piece of wood is literally green. I cut it from this tree. It's still alive. It's a windblown beech tree. We need to finish cutting it up. But I cut it 10 days ago. It's full of cracks. This piece of beech, on the other hand, has no cracks. It's 2 years old. It's been in our barn. It's ready for burning. It is properly dry. The idea that cracks in the piece of wood tell you anything useful is not true. So what's going on? Why has this wood cracked? Well, wood is composed of a load of tubes, which is very much like a bundle of paper straws. Now, water vapor is going to find it much easier to come out of the open end than it would through the wall of the straw. This cardboard here is representing the bark. Now, it's a vapor barrier. It'll stop it drying out in the living tree. And also, when you're trying to dry your firewood, it does the same thing. That's why it's important to split your wood if you possibly can. Now, as the wood begins to dry, the outer part is bigger than the inner rings, and so as it dries, that has more material to lose, so it generates stress. That's relieved through the cracking. So the only reason the cracks are here is because the end of the wood is beginning to dry, and it tells you nothing about what's going on inside. It certainly doesn't tell you if it's properly dry and ready to burn. That's a myth. Now, here's something interesting. These two pieces of wood are the same branch that I cut off of that beech tree I showed you just a moment ago. Now, this one I split, this one I haven't, and I've been weighing them over the last 10 days. This one has lost 22% of its weight in that time, and this only 11, so it's dried half as fast. So what this tells us is that if you possibly can split your logs, it dramatically increases the drying and cuts down the amount of time you have to store it for. If it's a bit too small to split, you can at least take off some of the bark, and that will help it dry out a lot quicker as well. That's good to know. So why do we dry firewood anyway? It'd be easier just to burn it green, wouldn't it? I have actually known people who do that. They just add a bit extra coal to their fire to get their firewood to burn. But think about this. If you have a kilo of wood, this is a couple of kilos, but say 1 kilo of wood, or 2.2 pounds, if you have an additional 10% water in it, that's another 100 grams, or 3.5 ounces in American, that you have to get rid of. Now, that's a third of a coffee cup. Now, that's water you're not just boiling, but evaporating. Think about how much energy that would take, and then multiply it by the several tons of firewood you might get through in a winter. That's a huge amount of heat that could be heating your house instead of being used to boil off loads of water. The second reason is for the health of your chimney. Now, wet wood burns cooler, and it doesn't burn fully. All the black smoke you get from wet wood fire is actually unburnt fuel just going up into the sky, but it can also accumulate on the inside of your chimney, build up, and eventually cause a chimney fire. That's no good at all. When you clean your chimney, keep an eye on the soot or ash that comes out of the chimney. If it's a fine, light powder, you'll probably be burning good dry wood, but if it's dark and tarry, you probably need to attend to your drying a bit more. That's useful. Myth number 2. Wood changes color when it's dry. This just isn't true either. This piece of beech is dry. It's been sat here in the woodshed for a couple of years, and this one is green. This is what I keep showing you. They're the same color. This is pine, and this is wonderfully dry ash. There's almost no difference between them at all. Now, wood can discolor, like this one, but this is a result of UV light. This piece of wood was on the edge of our wood pile, so the sun was shining on it, where this one was deeper inside and the sun didn't shine on it. All this tells you is that it's been in the sun for a little while, and it happens to wet wood just as quickly as it happens to dry wood. So wood discoloring when it's dry, that's another myth. So what about myth number 3, that the bark falls off of wood when it's dry? Well, this isn't true either. This piece of pine, the bark is falling off, but this is also a bit of pine. Bark is firmly attached. This bit of ash the bark is kind of coming off in a few places, but this bit of beech, the bark is firmly attached all around. All of this wood is perfectly dry. The bark coming off or not doesn't tell you anything useful at all, just a myth. Myth number 4, you can just feel when the wood is ready. I don't think I could tell if this was 5 or 10% heavier than I would expect based on its volume just by looking at it. I'm going to put this one down as a myth. There are 2 reliable ways you can use to tell if firewood is actually dry. One of them is to weigh it green and then keep weighing it until it stops losing weight. Not many people are going to do that, unless you're me. The other way is to use one of these. It's a moisture meter. Now this one is made by Still or Steel, depending on how you like to pronounce it. And it has these 2 metal prongs. You push it into your sample of wood, it sends a bit of an electric charge through the wood to measure its conductivity. The wetter it is, the more conductive it is, to get down to your 15 to 20% moisture. Now these things are fantastically useful. I bought this a couple of years ago. It's worth its weight in gold. That brings me to myth number 5, that you can use a moisture meter to measure the outside of a log to tell the moisture content of the log and see if it's properly dry. This just isn't the case. The outside of the piece of wood can be dry and the inside still be wet. Now imagine if you had a scrunched up towel that was soaking wet, you leave it on the floor. The outside could become dry while the inside is still soaking wet. The same thing can happen with wood. Now I measured this one, this should be dry. It's been here in the shed for a couple of years. It's reading 18% on the outside. We'll split it and have a look and see what the moisture content is on the inside. So the correct way to use a moisture meter is to split the wood and then measure the moisture content of the new split face. That tells you what's going on inside the log, which is what you want to know. This is measuring 18%, just like the outside, so we know it's properly dry and fit for burning. Now, assuming that it's representative of the whole pile, which it should be, we can say that the entire store of wood here is all ready to go. So this is the piece of green beech I keep showing you that I cut 10 days ago. It is measuring 14% moisture content on the outside, and of course the ends are cracked too. So according to most of the advice you see on the internet, this should be perfectly dry. Let's split it in half and see what's going on the inside. So 14% on the outside, 47% moisture on the inside. This is not suitable for burning. That's another myth debunked. I mentioned earlier that you're not actually aiming for 0% moisture content in your firewood. I mean, it sounds like a great idea. You'd have far less water to boil off. It'd save a lot of energy, like I was talking about before. But actually, it's not a practical thing to do. I mean, you could put the wood in an oven or a kiln and dry it right down to 0% moisture content. But as soon as you take it back out and put it in the air, it will begin to absorb moisture from the environment it's stacked in. It'll achieve an equilibrium to whatever your conditions are. In Britain, being cold and humid, it's tend to be a little bit higher than if you were in somewhere like Arizona, I suppose. So it's not a practical thing to do. Use air drying instead. The second reason is to do with the wood burning stove you're going to use. They're designed with a certain amount of combustion in mind. The airflow and the amount of wood that you can put in it and the moisture content of that wood is designed so that you'll get a good efficient burn. Now, if you have bone dry wood that goes into your wood burner, you could wind up with not enough air to combust it and you'll just end up venting lots of unburnt smoke. On the other hand, if you do have enough air flowing into your stove, you can wind up with kind of an out of control combustion, burn very, very hot, and could actually damage your stove. So 0% moisture content sounds like a great idea, but it actually isn't. Firewood myth number 6, all wood dries at 1 inch per year. Well, it might, but it might not. This wood behind me is going to take a lot longer if we don't get on and cut it up. So leaving it in big logs will certainly slow it down, as does leaving the bark on it. However, wood can dry an awful lot faster than that. That beech log that I had earlier was 4 inches thick. Now, in theory, that should take 2 years to dry, but I've been weighing it, and it's lost half of the weight that it's going to lose in total during its drying process. And that's after only 10 days. So that log is going to be perfectly dry after this coming summer. So that's another myth. Firewood myth number 7, all firewood is dry after 2 years. This isn't true. Well, it can be true. I'll get to that bit in a moment. But if you haven't split your wood, you've left it in great huge lumps, or you haven't taken the bark off of it, or you don't have it stored somewhere with good ventilation, it might never dry. And we learned this the hard way. When we first started cutting our own firewood, we decided to stack it in our garden shed and close the door. We had no idea what we were doing. We had no idea how much water needed to evaporate from green firewood, and so it all just rotted. It did make some beautifully colored mushrooms for us though. I next tried to stack it outside, thinking, well, it had plenty of ventilation, but of course then it just got rained on, and it never dried that way either. So I'm calling this a myth because there's not enough information there to know how to dry wood properly. So what you need to do is have it under cover, somewhere that has open sides to allow plenty of wind to dry the firewood. If you do that, that's the right way to dry firewood. It's how our ancestors have done it for countless centuries, and it's how we dry our firewood and how we know it's dry, even if you don't have a moisture meter. Nature will do the work for you. So there you go, 7 firewood myths debunked. I hope you enjoyed that. Happy burning, and I will see you next time.